And I remember those occasions, the school dance, and it would be, say, in St. John's Hall. And there on one side would be the girls, and the other side would be the boys. And there was an enormous distance between the two. And there was that terrible moment in your life when you thought, shall I walk across that floor, watched by everybody, and ask someone to dance? And today's our theme is the calling of Jesus. The great thing is that God comes to us. We don't have to wait. He comes to us. He's come to us in Jesus. The great fact of the incarnation. And you don't have to worry about the rejection. That used to be terrible. You would get right across the room and everybody would be watching you. And then she would say, no thanks. You had to make the big journey. I'm going to make a little journey because I put something over here that I hope people might look at, or somebody might look at. It's the Bible. And it's one of the two readings for today. And this is the first one. It says, the next day, Jesus was there again with two of his disciples. This is John 1:35. And he said, look, the Lamb of God. When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, what do you want? They said, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? Come, he replied, and you will see. So they went and saw where he was staying and spent that day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon, tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which means, when translated, Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, follow me. Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael, told him, we have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked. Come and see, said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false. How do you know me? Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Well, that was the lectionary of a week or two ago for the classical service. And so I found my way around here. Today's reading also follows the same kind of theme. Now, Alistair has been starting to go through the book of Genesis. Last week, I know he was talking about all the animals and Noah and the ark. And I don't know whether Jane knows or not, but I did send Alistair an email and said, you must listen to Bob Dylan's song, And God Made All the Animals, because it's a great song. So Alistair has been talking about the new coming in, the world that God creates and saw, as it keeps saying continually in the Authorized Version, and God saw that it was good. And it keeps saying and saying right through those first chapters and the second of Genesis. Whereas in the classical service, taking the lectionary, which I'm going to do because I don't dare tread into Genesis, because Alice is doing it, in the lectionary, it is also the sense of the new that is happening. It's all starting to come into fruition. As Mark says right at the very first verse of his gospel, this is the beginning of the Son of God. This is the good news. This is the gospel of Jesus. Mark's gospel doesn't bother itself with wise men, with shepherds, with all this, that, and the other. Not even with Bethlehem and mangers and stars and angels. Because Mark just wants to get into things, wants to tell you what all this means for humankind. And if you're going to get something moving, you've got to find people to come with you, to walk with you, to talk with you. And so it is in the lectionary for today. It continues the calling of the followers of Jesus. And this is how Mark sees it. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and they followed him. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father, Zebedee, in the boat with the hired men and followed him. And they went to Capernaum. One of the great things I find in Scripture is sometimes how something which has enormous ramifications is expressed in a very, very simple set of words. But sometimes, of course, as anybody who is good at something knows, that if somebody says to you, "Gosh, that was pretty simple," it's possibly because you spent hours and hours and weeks and maybe even years and years trying to do something. It's like in theatre and drama. Sometimes the most simplest sentences can provide the most difficult ones to be said. You may say it once the right way, but how do you actually do it? There was the famous theatre story of Laurence Olivier, who was on stage one night, and there was some young actors, and they were thrilled to be on stage with Laurence Olivier. And they went down to the dressing room, and they said, "How did you do it?" He said, I've no idea. I've no idea. There is a wonderful simplicity about both of those readings, and particularly about the reading from Mark's Gospel, because it hides so many things. It asks, how do we view Jesus? What was that power, that magnetism that he had, that sense of authority that he had, that seemingly enabled him to encounter various people, as we read in the story, the people who began to be his followers, that somehow within, maybe they'd heard Jesus. Well, it's true, one or two of the disciples. Some of them had heard John the Baptist, of course, proclaiming the coming and saying this was the one when Jesus was there to be baptized and was baptized. But somehow maybe they had heard, maybe they'd been in a crowd where Jesus had been. That when he confronted them where they were, they responded. There seemed to be no question, no argument, no discussion. Shall we not? Do we not? Shall we? The great glory of the Christian faith, as you've heard many, many times from preachers, and I'm sure you would agree, is its innate simplicity, its seemingly ordinariness, that God comes in the ordinary. God doesn't come to the big palaces. He doesn't come to the mighty of the world, but he comes to a couple, a young girl. He comes to a stable. And here in these readings, God comes to men who are about their work, about their job. I mean, did they suspect that something was going to happen at that moment in their lives? Did they think that suddenly there was going to be a mighty explosion of where they were? Were they people who were looking for a new direction? Were they looking for a vision? Were they looking for a hope? What was biting them? I sometimes think, They were doing what they had to do. They were getting their nets ready. They were fishermen. They were hoping for a big catch. And there's Jesus. He approaches. He must have had in his mind his thoughts that he had maybe seen these people. He knew something, or he had observed, he had watched. He knew he wanted a variety, because you get an enormous variety amongst these disciples. That he would approach them and say, look, I want you to follow me. I mean, you have to think. Putting it in contemporary kind of thought forms, it's almost like, say you were behind, I thought if I say a supermarket name, I'm promoting it, but let's say, well, anyway, we've got so many supermarkets. Let's say Sainsbury's anyway. There you are, you're on the cash till, you're working there. Or maybe you're working in one of the shoe shops here in Penzance. Maybe you're in one of the 340 coffee shops we have in Penzance, And suddenly, your life is moving on. It's just as it is. It has an equilibrium. It has a pace. And then suddenly there's someone standing there. And he looks. And he takes every one of you in. And he says to you, I want you to follow me. And the explosive nature, the simple nature, but which has enormous ramifications, because it seems so simple to say, and Jesus said, follow me. So they left their nets and they followed him. Oh, that's all over within 5-6 words. But there are lives at stake. It's a big moment. It's a big story. It's a big story. I often have what some people think I have stupid thoughts. But I was thinking about the lecture and thinking about this calling. And I'm not going to talk about President Trump, but he's been in the news because it's the first anniversary. How a year has gone by, extraordinarily. But I wondered what the nation would say if on the BBC News they said, and tomorrow's lectionary is about the calling of the disciples to form the most explosive moment that's ever happened in the world's history. That Jesus has called men to follow him. Well, maybe women, hopefully, today as well. Wow, I thought that's what the news could be. Because that is the most explosive thing that has happened, we believe, as Christians, that here was set into motion an extraordinary history to come. That he was going to choose these ordinary men to tell a story. As I was saying when I was preaching on the John at the classical service last Sunday, I think it was, it's very important to tell stories. Stories are what we do. It's important always to tell a story. And when faith and when religions start to cease, it's because people have ceased to tell a story. And where I spent time in London living with a Jewish family, they told stories. They remembered the great moments. They celebrated the great moments in their home of the Old Testament. If only we as Christians were celebrating our great people, our great figures, our great saints regularly. But here we are. Jesus approaches the disciples and he chooses these men to follow him. Wow. This maybe takes you back. This is a Methodist circuit plan from 1971, when all of us, apart from 1 or 2 people who are still young here, were fairly young people. 1971. And I was looking at the list of names. I don't know if they would make any sense. You may remember some of the names. Let me see, who can I read? The light isn't very good. I'm not doing very well with the light on this one, I don't think. It's in very dark print. Mr. Wallace, Mr. Warren, Mr. Guard, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Hall, Mr. George Rowe. But here down this page are the list of local preachers in the Methodist circuit here in 1971. And it starts off not because Chapel Street is the biggest, because it's the first alphabetically with a C, Chapel Street, 1971, just for your interest, had a membership of 244. And even more, the assessment was £315. £315. And so this plan is getting a bit tatty. As you can see, it's falling to bits. It opens up, and we can see who is Frederick Rain was the minister at the time. And we had preachers Mrs. Linford, Mr. Bartle, Stevens, Trevithick, Bertram Woods, Mr. Bird, who was had been a great missionary, I think, in the missionary church. These are talking about the preachers and the people. These are the people who preceded us, the people who heard the call of Jesus to follow him. Because, I mean, I could, and I was, and I don't know where I've put the piece of paper, but I was going to do a little bit of explanation about some of the disciples. They all had kind of nicknames, do you notice? Jesus gave them nicknames. And there are some amusing interludes, isn't there? How did you know me? And somehow Jesus had observed him and knew what he was called. One part of my life I did some supply teaching in a very rough area of London. And if you're a supply teacher in a rough area of London, you'll find bedlam when you go into the classroom. They don't bother whether you're in the room or not, but there we are. But I always remember how I won the class. It was a simple process. If anybody might like to take it on board, perhaps. I don't know. I asked some of the teachers, I said, who's the troublemaker in 3B? So they said somebody called Thomas. John Thomas. So, of course, when I got to the room, there was this boy on the desk shouting away. I said, John Thomas. He said, how do you know me? And the other way of knowing what people are called, of course, is you wander around one part of the room, and in your head you get a few names. You get to the other end of the room, and then, of course, you address the other side. And you name the people who are on the other side. And there is that, isn't there, an amusing part of the story in the calling of the disciples. He said, how do you know my name? And Jesus knew his name. I read this when I was preaching on the other passage to the classical service. Our Methodist heritage, our Methodist background, has been one in which you might say ordinary men and women, not people who are of the clergy, of the cloth, have been called to be followers, to be preachers. Every year in the Methodist Recorder, they have a double page of those who have left this world for the next. An extraordinary band, Methodism, would collapse tomorrow if it wasn't for its lay preachers. And this is interesting about Mr. Wesley. When John Wesley wanted to find the gospel for people who he felt were being neglected, people he felt were being forgotten by the conventional church of the time, which was one of the reasons why Methodism, or the people of the method, why it came into being. Large swathes of the population were not being addressed with the gospel by the Church of England. But anyway, it says, of the 35 helpers whose autobiographies are included in the volumes entitled Wesley's Veterans, 23 represent the following occupations which they or their fathers followed: miner, clothier, farmer, soldier, carpenter, mason, apprentice in the worsted trade, tanner, gardener, cutler, apprentice in China trade and labor. The father of one of the remainder was manager of a woolen factory. One of the preachers was a bookseller, one was a schoolmaster, one a builder, one secretary to a justice of the peace. The other 7 preachers did not think it worthwhile to make statements as to their mundane occupations. Jesus called these men. They went and told others. We can spend a great deal of time, and the church does spend an enormous amount of time, organizing conferences, big sessions on evangelism. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people gather at the Central Hall in Westminster or wherever, where some organization has hired it for the day to talk about evangelism. But the real hard thing about evangelism is there in the gospel, in the reading. Come and see. In the end of the day, each of us here are the evangelists. Each of us here this morning are those who should be sharing the gospel. Sharing the gospel of Jesus. Because we have seen his glory. We have seen the glory of God in the Word made flesh, that God so loved that he gave. We share, we bring, and we bring ourselves. The essence of evangelism, the simple but so difficult, so hard part of evangelism is here wrapped up in this simple, straightforward narrative. Come and see. Wrapped up within those people he called were all kinds. The one we know best, of course, is Simon, who Jesus gave the name Peter, who was the rock. He, more than any of the others, is the one we meet throughout the Gospels. In all kinds of situations, we meet Peter in moments of great heights. He often seems to come to the rescue when there is a silence, when Jesus says, "Whom do men say that I am?" Oh, they think about it for a moment, and Peter is the one who says, "Thou art the Christ. Thou art the Christ." The one who realizes in more dramatic moments that in Jesus is the center of all things, to which all life comes, to which the world must come. It was there in this child, the baby, the Bethlehem child. It's there in the grown man, Jesus, who still 2,000 years later still calls the Martin Luther King Juniors, the Gladys Aylwards, the Florence Nightingales, the Billy Grahams, the John Stotts, the one who confronts the Pierre de Chardins, who confronts the Desmond Tutus, the one who can still tear the world apart for God, for Jesus, for life, for living, who still calls some who become famous, 95%, 96% of us are just called to be where we are, called to be here as we are at this particular moment in this town called Penzance, or if you live outside this area of Penrith. Jesus comes to us, to each of us, to all people. There's no great biblical exposition waiting, I don't think, to be had here. It's just something put so simply, so clearly, but because it is so simple and so clearly, it has enormous significance, because if you say yes to Jesus, you are entering a lifetime that will take you through so many journeys, the ups and the downs, and the heights. Come, said Jesus, follow me. Before the band continue, and I'd like us to sing a song, if you don't mind. I haven't told Len I'm going to sing this song. I'm going to sing it. It's a song you well know if you know it. Please join with me as as I thought of a song in relation to these passages. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Do sing. Turn your eyes, oh wow, on Jesus. This wasn't planned. Full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Once more, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Do you want a new life? Do you want a new calling? Do you want a new purpose? Follow Jesus. He says, come and see.